The 1930s was the decade when colour film first started to erode the long domination of the monochrome image. A series of technological breakthroughs in film processing made it possible for amateur as well as professional filmmakers to record the rich, vibrant colours of the natural world. Several processes such as Dufay colour, Kodacolour and Technicolor reached the market, a development that presented enthusiasts with a new world of creative possibilities. At last, colour film was used to capture everything from major historical events to the intimate details of everyday life. Colour film was expensive, so it largely remained the preserve of the wealthy. They used it to record special moments in their lives, including encounters with distinguished personalities and journeys to exotic lands. One of the first to appreciate the exciting potential of colour film was the wealthy British adventuress Rosie Newman. On her travels, Rosie trained her lens on spectacular parades and some of the great treasures of antiquity. And closer to home, her cameras glimpsed fun and games in the north, and fleeting moments in the life of a young princess who did not yet know she would become a queen. Ignoring the threat of war, on the 4th of March 1938, Rosie embarked on another foreign adventure. Caught up in the vogue for all things Egyptian, created by recent archaeological discoveries, she headed for North Africa. On the 9th of March 1938, Rosie's ship reached Egypt's biggest seaport, Alexandria, where she was helped ashore by teams of porters.
And there's one person in particular who comes up in his uniform with a sword as well. And he's so proud and he looks so fine. And I thought, what a wonderful way to be greeted to Egypt.
Rosie set out to follow the course of the Nile, travelling south to take in Egypt's many temples and antiquities. She headed to Cairo, where she stayed with friends from the British Embassy. Soon, with her camera, she was exploring the largest city in Africa.
Rosie goes to the more traditional part of the city, the old city, and she takes some great footage along Muski, along the main shopping street, which is still the main shopping street in old Cairo, in the souk. Another thing that she shows in this part of the city is a lot of men who are dressed well, some of them are sort of dressed halfway Western. They're wearing sports jackets. They're also wearing the tarbush, the fez, which is a hangover from the Ottoman Turkish period. And below that, some of them are wearing a galabia, a long gown, which is from the Arab period. So in a way, you see these men walking down the street and they're a sort of walking historical document in the way that they're dressed.
Sometimes an old man would sit outside a small shop, contentedly smoking his hookah, a little opium often being added to the bowl. You also see the picturesque water carrier tinkling his bell and shouting 2 milliam, the equivalent of a farthing, for a glass of drinking water. Carts carrying as many as 20 women dressed all in black, herded in close together. That is how they transport their wives and women.
The majority of the women you see are veiled. This tends to be actually an urban practice. Deveiling had begun to occur in Egypt by the time Rosie visited. But I think it's also fair to say that the feminist movement was very much an elite movement.
After filming in the souk, Rosie stopped for drinks at the European expats' favourite watering hole.
If you were wealthy, if you were glamorous, you would want to be seen at Shepherd's, where you would sit and have a drink and watch the world go by outside.
Like the Shepherd's Hotel, the Gezira Sporting Club, built by the British after their occupation of Egypt in 1882, epitomised the British desire to create a home away from home.
Imperial clubs were a way of separating the British, the ruling class, from the people they governed in the colonies. But few were as luxurious and magnificent as the Gezira Club.
But at Cairo's racecourse, the atmosphere was more relaxed, and there was more of a mixing of cultures. Just a few miles away at Giza stood a monument that testified to an age when Egypt was itself a powerful empire.
We saw the Great Pyramid of unnumbered stones standing majestically, defying time, disdainful of human criticism, beside the colossal Sphinx, hewn out of solid rock. It's the expression of man's greatness.
It is fairly deserted while she's there, and it certainly is a contrast to today when it is a much sort of busier scene, and the pyramids are virtually on the edge of Cairo now. They're virtually being swallowed up by the ever-expanding city.
On the 16th of March, Rosie took the train from Cairo to Luxor, where she was spellbound by the temples, some of which were almost 4,000 years old.
We drove out to Karnak and were amazed at the beautiful proportions of these colossal ruins, the unique avenue of rams and the elegant columns carved with papyrus and lotus plants. The history of bygone days seems still to linger there.
Once again, Rosie had the luxury of exploring one of the world's great archaeological sites almost entirely by herself. 4 days later, she took a boat down the Nile towards Aswan.
Aswan was always the frontier of Egypt. At the time of the pharaohs, it was a trading post. It's as far south as you can sail up the Nile. At that point, you hit the cataracts, which are a series of rapids. Egypt goes on further, but beyond there is effectively another country.
We took a rowing boat and were followed by small black boys, each in a tiny canoe made of tin trays. They raced one another for bakshish. We named them the Water Babies.
The entourage passed Elephantine Island, home to a population whose lives had been transformed by the construction of the first Aswan Dam, which was completed in 1902.
You see these Egyptian agriculture, winnowing and water raising. And she says, look, this is what has been happening for 1,000 years. But look, here is this great dam. Here is Western engineering and technology. Here is the new world coming to Egypt.
It's one of the world's great engineering projects in the way that, I don't know, sort of the Empire State Building was when it was built. And going across in that little boxcar as she does, it's a very small railway that was built across the top, would have been a great thrill. It would have been something you would have wanted to go and see.
The dam had many economic advantages, but it left scores of Nubian villages 50 feet underwater. One of Egypt's most important ancient monuments was also submerged.
One thing they couldn't move above the water level was the Temple of Philae. And Rosie shows it as two bits of masonry sticking out above the water. But if you've ever seen a picture of Philae, you'll know that below the water there is one of the great temples of the world. It's an extraordinary building.
In the desert near Aswan, Rosie visited the villages of the mainly Muslim and nomadic Bisharin people.
The Bisharin are very clearly a Nubian tribe. That part of Egypt is in fact known as Nuba. It has its own culture, it has its own identity, which is quite strong even today.
But in her memoir, Rosie dismissed Bisharin culture in terms that today would be considered derogatory and racist.
Early, we set off to see a camp of the Bisharin, a wild, poverty-stricken tribe. Living in mud huts in the Arabian desert, they wore their hair gollywog fashion, or in numerous plats. They skillfully performed a sword dance accompanied by strange noises.
On the return journey, Rosie stayed at the home of the British Army officer, Colonel Wilfred Jennings Bramley, in Egypt's western desert. She filmed nearby at the Burj Al Arab, an experimental community that had been created by Bramley in 1915.
The Burj Al Arab village was kind of sort of social engineering, an attempt to create a model village and to settle the tribes and to sort of turn them to useful, productive tasks and integrate them more fully into the Egyptian nation.
Social experiments such as the Burj Al Arab were by no means the only influence that Britain exerted on Egyptian life. At Alexandria, Rosie filmed Nile barges carrying bales of cotton. Because of British financial backing, it had become the country's biggest crop.
A lot of Egyptian farmers were encouraged to grow cotton rather than food, and when the price of cotton collapsed on the world market, there was significant difficulty in the fields in Egypt.
If Rosie was troubled by the poverty she encountered during her journey, she made few references to it, either in her memoirs or her films.
She's trying to see Egypt, but she's still walking very well-trodden paths, and I don't think she truly sort of breaks free or has a particularly independent view of Egypt. I think, in a sense, she views Egypt through rose-tinted spectacles, and she rarely questions what she's seeing.
Rosie captures the last hurrah of the British in Egypt. The Second World War, just 1 year away, changes everything. There's no hint of it in this film. If she'd gone and asked the people in the Gezira Club, would you believe that in 2-3 years' time you will no longer be masters in this way? They would have said no. They wouldn't have believed it.
On the 26th of March 1938, amid chaotic scenes at Alexandria's harbour, Rosie boarded a ship bound for home.
Then, as the ship steamed slowly out, I felt Egypt had cast her spell in one brief month, and that I had seized the exceptional opportunities given me of bringing home to others a living memory of a trip which I had enjoyed so much. We waved farewell to this ancient land of beauty, romance, and untold treasure belonging to the pharaohs.